today we're looking at the Biostar Racing X370 GTN motherboard. This is the first mini ITX AM4 motherboard on the Ryzen platform, featuring a maximum of 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, M.2 support on the backside, and right now it is $110 on Newegg. In addition to the motherboard in the box, you'll also get 4 SATA cables, all of which have straight connectors on the ends, a pamphlet teaching you just how to use your LED control on the motherboard, rear I/O cover, a driver disc, which doesn't make much sense considering most ITX cases will not give you the option of having a disk drive anyways, and of course your motherboard's user manual for detailing things like just where to plug in those pesky front panel connectors. So obviously if you're watching this video, there's a good chance you're watching it because of the thing in the dead center of the motherboard, and that is that AM4 socket, which supports all current Ryzen processors, as well as ones that have not been released yet, such as the Ryzen 3 processors or AMD's upcoming APUs using the AM4 socket. And going around the processor, we have a 7-phase power delivery system, which should give you solid overclocking options, provided that you can provide the cooling necessary to your chips, especially those high-end 8-core ones tend to run a little bit on the warm side, specifically the 1700X and 1800X, but if you can keep them cool, this motherboard should be able to overclock just fine. Tucked away in the top left corner of the motherboard is your 4-pin CPU power connector. Also above the socket are a couple of 50/50 RGB light strip headers along the top of the motherboard, which gives you access to the ability to plug in your light strips and sort of use the motherboard to light up your case with RGB strips. That's a nice touch. Next to those headers, you have your CPU fan header. On the other side of your RAM slots that we'll get to in just a second, you have a system fan header. Now your DDR4 slots here will support up to 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM at 3200 megahertz. That means 16 gigabytes per slot is supported. And for an ITX board, 32 gigabytes is pretty standard, and it will be more than enough for the vast majority of all people building systems. That being said, obviously, if 32 gigabytes is not enough for you, this is not the motherboard for you. Moving towards the bottom half of the motherboard, obviously up here we have our 24-pin connector along the right side. Directly below the 24-pin, you have your front panel connectors. Now, if you're familiar with an ATX motherboard layout, a lot of times those are sort of down here along the bottom, but obviously with ITX, you don't have the room down there, so they're moved over to the right side. Directly beside your front panel connector and in an obvious location, you have a header to connect a speaker for things like error codes. Directly below those, you'll see 2 of your SATA connectors, the other 2 being directly above the PCIe slot. Below the right side SATA connectors is our front panel USB 3 header. And then moving along the bottom of the motherboard, we have our 1 PCIe by 16 slot. And towards the left side of that, but directly above it, is our front panel HD audio connector. And sort of the last thing of note is that there is an LED light up effect here behind the heatsink, so you can also sync that up. That would be an RGB strip as well, I believe, so you can sync that up to match the rest of your system, especially if you're using the RGB light strip headers above. And moving to the rear I/O, this is where any APU support will come into play. For integrated graphics, we have an HDMI out as well as a DVI out there. On the far left side, we have 2 USB 3.1 Gen 1, that would be the 5 gigabit per second ports, above which is a PS2 port for things like legacy mice. Sort of in the middle of the board, we have our 2 USB 3.1 Gen 2, that would be the 10 gigabit per second ones. We have 1 Type A connector and 1 Type C connector. Just to the right of that, we have 2 more 3.1 Gen 1 USB connectors, as well as our Realtek LAN solution. And on the far right side, we have our audio solution, which is fairly typical of motherboards today. And on the back side of the motherboard, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention the M.2 slot here, which does support 80mm NVMe drives in case you want to go that route. However, being on the back side of the motherboard, it may be a little bit difficult to get to once your system is assembled, as a lot of mini ITX motherboards won't have a cutout large enough to access that SSD once it's either installed or left empty. So if you are planning to go this route, you may want to install it before you are done with your system. Don't sort of put it off like you may put off other storage options. Or if you do decide to add one later on, just be prepared to completely disassemble your system, or at least disassemble a significant part of it. So let me know in the comments down below, how many of you have ever built ITX systems? Do you find their form perfect? perfect for you, or do you like the flexibility of a full tower better? As always, if you like this content, give me a like, share, subscribe, and comment below because that helps me out a ton. You can follow me on Instagram and on Twitter at Hoosier Hardware. They are the same tag for your convenience. And as always, we'll go ahead and let YouTube queue up a couple more videos from my channel for you to watch. I'm Shane with Hoosier Hardware, and I'll see you guys in the next video.